Well, hello. Today I'd like to talk to you about a book by Dan Simmons. I'm doing the second in the series of 4 in the Hyperion Cantos. I'd like to talk to you about the fall of Hyperion. So previously, we discussed Hyperion. Sorry, the shrike is kind of spiky and sharp. I forgot that till I touched him there. Now, Dan Simmons originally envisioned it as a single book, this book, called the Hyperion Cantos, but the publishers, except for apparently the publishers of this edition, which, now I'm wondering whose edition this is. Doesn't really say. Berryville Graphics, so, okay. Well, anyway, so he envisioned it as being a single book. But the publishers wanted him to do it as 2 books, which made sense from a publishing perspective, because then you get to sell 2 books. And the first one, Hyperion, was released in 1988. The second one, Fall of Hyperion, came out in 1990. And see, I'm being careful not to touch Mr. Spiky there. I will point out, on the cover of this one, let's see if I can get autofocus to do anything here. There is a man handing a baby to Spiky Dude. I think I just went out of focus when I did that. Alright, so, learn something. I can actually control focus while I'm doing this. Can't control any other settings, but I can control focus. But anyway, yes, that is a scene in the movie. Or, in the book. Well, there's talk about it being a movie, but that's a topic for another video. There is a scene in the book where he hands his infant daughter to Spiky Dude the Shrike. So, yeah. So, obviously, since these books are one book, and they do not stand alone at all, Fall of Hyperion is the sequel and continuation to Hyperion. And although I try really hard not to do serious spoilers about the books I'm reviewing, I will give you a spoiler warning right now if you have not read Hyperion, because there will be spoilers about Hyperion. This review would end up being so vague and... vague? There was a word in my brain, but it just... because I waited till 8:55 at night to record this video, so my brain is hamburger. But anyway, it would be so vague that it would just be, I like the characters, neat setting, that was fun. So, I will say that this book takes on a new style from Hyperion, whereas Hyperion kind of followed the structure of Geoffrey Chaucer's, not Hyperion Cantos, Canterbury Tales. I am so sorry. We followed the adventures of 7 pilgrims on their way to the Time Tombs and hopefully an encounter with the Shrike. But what happened is the book was structured as each one told their tale, except for Mr. Het Mustine, who was disappeared from the wind wagon they were on. He was in his private cabin, and when they investigated his cabin, he was gone, and there was a lot of blood. So we never got to find out what happened with him, or what his story was. Yeah, the man on the cover, that's Saul Weintraub. That's his daughter, Rachel. And that is one of the sadder stories in the original Pilgrim's Tales. I will also say, I'm sorry, I gotta do this. Now that I know I can autofocus, sort of. Oh, maybe not if I'm that close. So the original Hyperion cover... I'm looking at my screen so I know how I'm focusing. I love that. Caught my eye immediately, and I didn't notice it until I reread it a few years ago. The Shrike has 4 arms. The author forgot 2. In the sequel, same. Did I say author? I meant artist. Same artist. Now they're more hidden in shadow, but again, 2 arms. The artist doesn't get it right until later in the series, but eventually the artist does add those other 2 arms. But, you know, kind of a little annoying detail. I watched one reviewer who was upset about how this part of the cover was done and it didn't match between the 4 books. And I'm like, but he got the Shrike wrong! So, but anyway, back on subject, because this is an art review. This novel, instead of those stylistically different stories with kind of a thin overarching story, what this novel does is it takes us kind of as I would call an almost omniscient, godlike type of viewpoint. We read the novel basically through the lens of a gentleman named Joseph Severn. That's the name of the artist who took care of the poet John Keats as he lay dying in Italy of what he called consumption, but tuberculosis. And but this Joseph Severn is actually another hybrid, which means he has an artificial intelligence, but he's in a human body, of the poet John Keats, who, if you remember, was one of the if you've read the book, one of the romances in, I think it was the last story, and this woman is carrying a copy of his artificial personality in a loop in her head. And she's also pregnant with his kid, but the kid really doesn't come into the story at all. So thank you, Dan Simmons, for not using a pregnant woman just to drum up artificial drama. Did I remember to refocus myself? Sorry if I didn't. Now he has, and you don't really learn why until later, but he has access to the very highest levels of government. He's in meetings with she's not the president, she's called the CEO, but the CEO of the Hegemony of Man, Mina Gladstone, as she meets different people in different groups as they're waging their war against the ousters who are moving in on the Hegemony of Man, which is the universe. But when he sleeps, and I think this was really why he was engaged, he sees the 7 pilgrims. And yes, this is a mild spoiler, but I don't think it's unexpected. Het Mestine, the one who disappeared, reappears in this, somewhat the worse for wear. And, he doesn't last long, but he does reveal, finally, not his full story, but his connection to the John Keats hybrid and what the reason he was on the pilgrimage. But spoilers, because, that's in this novel. But, and actually, a surprise guest shows up. So, if you'll remember, Father, and in my notes, I have it crossed out every time I mention his name, because I wrote the wrong name, because I have read the other 2 novels since then, and another character has gotten into my brain. But anyway, Father Hoyt dies. Sorry, that's the spoiler. And is resurrected, again, it's now 901, as Father Duray. So if you'll remember, his story was the first one told in the original book. This is the man who, Father Hoyt had accompanied Father Duray to the planet Hyperion. And then Father Duray continued on to meet the Bakura people and study them, and ended up being infected with what he called the cruciform, which is a parasite. It's shaped like a cross. It's kind of here. But the Bakura had been resurrected continually for generations by this parasite. They'd lost their genitals. They'd lost their intelligence. They'd lost their hair. They were very simple. And there is a reason suggested in the book, but again, spoilers, so we won't go there. But the important thing is, he was so horrified by this fate. So I talked about body horror in my original review. That's the body horror. All these Bakura are infected by this cruciform parasite, and so is he. And he is terrified of being resurrected and eventually becoming like them through multiple resurrections. So he ended crucifying himself. I was unsure how he managed to attach all parts of his body, but he crucified himself on one of the flame trees that kept the Bakura isolated. And the flame trees, I'm trying to work out how their biology exactly works, but Suffice it to say, he spent 7 years of his life crucified, and when I say crucified, I mean nails, well, probably on just one of them, because how did he nail the rest? And somehow he attached his feet to one of these flame trees, so basically getting electrocuted and burned to death over and over for 7 years, and then resurrected by this cruciform parasite. And Father Hoyt came back to check on him and found him there, and the parasite came off, and Father DeRay, horribly mangled, burned body, smiles a little and then dies. But Father Hoyt ended up having first his own cruciform put on him, and also Father DeRay's cruciform put on him. So he's carrying 2 of these critters now. So when he dies, he's resurrected as Father DeRay. And honestly, I never liked Father Hoyt, and then reading the next 2 sequels, mild spoiler, I definitely didn't like him. So I was happy to see Father DeRay come back, because he was much more interesting. We do get to see each pilgrim's final encounter in this book with the Shrike, and they do pay off well. My least favorite is probably Colonel Cassad, mainly because he did battle with the Shrike, so it was a lot of descriptions of battle, and my eyes just started to glaze over, I'm sorry. But we do end up finding out, remember, one of the characters, Colonel Cassad had seen one of the characters impaled on the Shrike's Tree of Pain. We find out what it is, or who it was, sorry, and we find out what the Tree of Pain is. We learn a lot about the different factions in this far future society, especially by having scenes with Mina Gledstone and with Joseph Severn. We see a lot of the far future space battle, but what I liked about it, they're not trying to do that. I always hated, like in Star Wars, that pew 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 stuff where they're flying around. We're doing dogfights even though we're in space. I mean, my eyes wanted to glaze over in those parts of Star Wars. They didn't do that. Mainly, it was flashes of light up in the sky seen by the people on the planet. And the battle is about them. The fate of the battle really affects them. But they're kind of removed from it. I thought it was handled well. There was a little bit, maybe too much discussion of tactics. When we were with the CEO. But the results of the discussion were important. And I think it could have been condensed, but the politics were important. And see, that's a Dan Simmons thing. He works out his books in depth. You read any of them. Very, very much depth. And I feel like he edits, because I forget what book it was, but he talked about how he had all the walls of his office lined up with outlines and diagrams and characters and things. I would love to be able to do that. But anyway, he edits, obviously, but even so, a lot of depth remains. So I'm just trying to imagine what the author's notes look like. But at the same time, it can make for skippable reading. And he does continue with his literary references. Now, I'm not an English guy. I'm a physics major. I know some literature. Thanks to Dan Simmons, I've learned a little bit more. But John Keats's unfinished poetry continues to make an appearance. We get more about the environmentalist John Muir, M-U-I-R. I forgot to look up how his name is pronounced. But anyway, I've got a book over there of his I'm going to read soon, after I get done with this Hyperion thing. But then you get also some discussion of the religious philosophy, which turns out to be interesting, because if I could do a spoiler, you would see why it's interesting. It plays into kind of one of the themes of the book. But anyway, some discussion of the religious philosophy of Jesuit and paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Father DeRay is a big follower of him. And of course, Saul Weintraub was some kind of a professor of religious studies in the first book. And it is through this lens we learn a lot of things, like who made the Shrike and why, which later novels make a little more ambiguous. Who is Moneta? We get an answer to that one. Who made the time tunes and why? We get an answer to that one. We learn kind of what the time tunes are about, but the next two books delve into that in a little more depth. And we also learn where the cruciform parasite came from and why. So we get a lot of answers finally. Some of these mysteries are solved. You know, people who felt like, well, Hyperion just kind of ended there. You see how if they were all one book, it makes more sense. So in the high government meetings, you know, CEO Mina Gledstone, who appeared in the previous book and was mentioned a few times, finally becomes a character in her own right. And usually I don't like characters at that level because they're not the ones doing things. Only in this case, she actually is. I mean, the meetings drag a little bit, but she's... A lot of things that happen in this book hinge on her. So we see how she wields power and what her plans are. We learn a lot more about the artificial intelligences of the Technocore, how they interact with each other, how they interact with their environment. We learn about lions and tigers and bears, and we get our first hints of something called the Void Which Binds. And we get to see how much human technology actually relies on or came from the Technocore. And of course, like in the last book, but they're dealt with in more depth, two of the important technologies are Farcasters. So think transporters on Star Trek, only you actually move from point A to point B through this portal thing by means which are a little bit unclear, just seemingly instantaneous transport. And that allows for some interesting things that I don't see in a lot of science fiction. So it allows for almost instantaneous transport of people, goods, or they're trying to set up a Farcaster around Hyperion to bring in naval ships, spaceships even. And there are some neat civilian applications of it. One is what's called the Grand Concourse, which is a 100-kilometer long main street with shops and stores from all the different worlds that are connected by these Farcasters. And you just go from one world to the next as you walk along this main street, as you pass through different portals. There's something called the River Tethys. It's a river that, again, is on multiple planets, and you can boat and go from the different planets. I kind of worry about invasive species, but one of the things that was brought up a lot in Hyperion was about how the hegemony of man was really good about killing off anything that was good or local or native. And another interesting one was homes with rooms on multiple worlds. Now, I don't have many rooms in this house, but I guess I could have 3 different planets and maybe have my bathroom on a 4th planet, so that might be kind of fun. Then the other technology is Fatline, which allows instant communication. I was more vague how that worked, because apparently Fatline was used, people have these implants, they're able to access the web, get any information they want. And remember, 1990, they can get any information they want and communicate instantly all through the web, with the aid of the Technocore. All through implants, and you can communicate with anybody. Now, the Outback worlds like Hyperion, there's no Farcaster, and apparently the web is just a local thing. But I also know that at several points messages were sent via Fatline, even though conversations weren't had, so I felt like maybe that technology could have been explained a little bit better. But you do get to see how the hegemony of man was held together, and you get to see the technological power of the Technocore, and you get a good hint of how the Technocore and the hegemony of man are kind of interdependent. And we also learned that there are several factions in the Technocore that have different plans for humanity. And some of them are kind of horrible. The title of the book really has multiple meanings. One, of course, is the fall of Hyperion, the world Hyperion, to the Ousters. And yeah, we do finally get to see Ouster society. They're interesting. I will say that. To say more would be spoilers. But they're interesting. And then maybe a more esoteric reference would be to John Keats' unfinished poem of the same name. You know, it's a quest where the poet is aided by a woman named Moneta, and is led on a quest through several levels of awareness, and deals with the fall of the Titan god Hyperion and his replacement by the Olympian god Apollo. And I'll just admit, poetry is another one of those things where my eyes just kind of skip, because I don't know why, I just struggle to read poetry. But, so we know something is going to fall. What's going to replace it? Well, obviously we're really talking about a major change in society, which, spoilers. So overall, the characters developed a lot of depth in the last book. They didn't get the chance to develop too much more in this book. But we did get to see their fates and kind of the natural conclusion to each of them. So more time was spent in this book developing Mina Gladstone and this Joseph Severn, who's another John Keats hybrid. And yeah, he goes by John Keats later on in the book. And then you have to remember, wait, there was an original John Keats who also went by Johnny. And yeah, that was annoying. But overall, I thought it was good. And at the end, you can understand Mina Gladstone. You know, her actions lead to absolute tragedy and horror. But at the same time, you know that they were absolutely necessary. So yeah, the two books together do tell the complete story. And it is a complete story. If you just had me start with the fall of Hyperion, I'd just be like, what? And if you left me with Hyperion and I got to the end, I'd just be like, what? Where's the rest? Where's the end? So yeah, they belong together. And when they're read together, it is a complete, intact story by itself. You can walk away and say, yes, we have completed this story. Excuse me. Now, there are some short stories, and there are 2 more novels coming, which I'll be doing in the coming weeks. Endymion and Rise of Endymion. And they pick up a lot of the threads in this book that are left dangling. Some of the things that you're just like, oh, I would have liked to know more about that. Yeah, they get fleshed out. You get to learn the ultimate fate of Father de Rey, the poet, Martin Selenius, sorry. And you get a whole shaft of new characters. You get to find out what the baby of the hybrid and, what was her name, Bronze something or other. You get to find out what the fate of the baby was. And you learn more about Moneta. And a whole lot more discussion of the Technocore and what's the ultimate destination of humanity. So, look forward to more in the coming weeks. And I am considering, although with school starting, maybe I should behave myself, I am considering doing a spoilery video after all that where I talk about some of the things where I just like, you know, that thing I can't talk about. You know, actually talk about some of them. Like, here's who the Shrike is. So, look forward to that. It may be not right away. And, yeah. So, I don't know if Dan Simmons had planned to write the Endymion novels or not, but I'm glad he did. It definitely fleshed out the story and gave humanity a destination. Yeah. So, I want to thank you for watching. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.